Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
This episode of the Workology Podcast is sponsored by ACE, the HR exam, and Upskill HR. This episode is also part of our Future of Work series, powered by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. PEAT works to start conversations around how emerging workplace technology trends are impacting people with disabilities. Today, I'm joined by Charlotte Dale. She's an entrepreneur and visionary for impactful change. Charlotte co-founded Cake Technologies, a mobile payment app that was acquired by American Express in 2017. She also co-founded Inclusively, a professional network connecting candidates with disabilities to employers who are cultivating diverse and inclusive workplaces. Inclusively was inspired by Charlotte's cousin, Cameron Northrup, who became the first licensed esthetician in Florida with Down syndrome. Charlotte, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be chatting to you guys.
Talk to us a little bit about your background and more about how you got involved in inclusivity and accessibility.
So I started out my career in finance in London, and about 5 years in, I decided to quit my job and start a company with one of my best friends, Cake Technologies. And we ended up selling that to Amex. And at that very same time was when my cousin became the first licensed facialist in the state of Florida with Down syndrome. And so my cousin Cameron is undoubtedly the inspiration behind Inclusively. After getting my first facial from her, I knew this would be my next company. It was just so clear to me that the career path she has always been told her whole life was far different than what she was actually able to achieve on her own. She'd always been interested in hair and makeup and anything to do with beauty, and for a very long time was washing and folding towels at a local salon. And of course, everyone has to start somewhere, but it seems often with disability, people view their starting point as also their ending point. And, what about career progression, just like everyone else? And so, I started looking into sort of how can we use technology to bridge this gap between employers and candidates like Cameron to make her story more common and hopefully one day even the norm.
What a great story. And I love that you're taking inspiration from your family, people that you love, and then building technology to help others like Cameron. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think that this demographic has traditionally been served by, government agencies and charities and nonprofits, which all work really hard to work with the candidate. But there's probably a lot of efficiencies if we could scale them up, make opportunities more available.
On your website, I noted this statistic. Out of the 50 million working age Americans who are disabled, only 29% participate in the workforce compared to 75% without a disability. What is the piece we're missing on the employer side?
I would say there's a few things. When I first started looking into how I could help solve this problem, I was looking at how I would go about looking for a job and then what would be missing in that process if I had specific accommodations that I needed or a really specific skill set. And ultimately what I found is that search criteria on mainstream job platforms really hasn't evolved in a meaningful way. And so the personalization that's penetrated and pretty much disrupted every other industry, such as travel, media, et cetera, really hasn't hit the recruitment space, which is quite ironic given that the majority of people spend their time, most of their time at their job. But without this personalization and the ability to really filter down on job opportunities that'll, be the most likely for success, it means that, people have to rely on nonprofits and charities and government agencies, which all do amazing work to support candidates, but they are often incredibly fragmented and localized networks So this means that if employers only have access to this talent pool through a really fragmented and localized network of nonprofits, it's really hard for them to hire this demographic at scale. And so you see companies start doing what they can, which is they'll cherry pick a couple of jobs and give them to a nonprofit. And the intention there is great, but this only really further marginalizes people into specific roles and limits the amount of opportunities that are really available. So I think what is missing, from the employer side is a really streamlined and efficient way to access this talent pool, just like they access other talent pools. And, getting rid of some of the misconceptions. Disability is there's a large spectrum, and we sometimes get asked, well, what can these people actually do? And it's, someone with a disability can do any job at your company. Just depends on what they want to do and what their capabilities are.
How does your background in tech impact the way you think about disability in the workplace?
So I think I'm probably the first person to say that I'm not the expert in the disability industry. I come from the tech background, and I'm still learning so much. And I just surround myself with experts that know a lot more than I do. But I think that my background in technology and building things from the ground up really provides a different lens that maybe hasn't traditionally been available historically in solving this problem. I'm always thinking about, how do we automate this? How do we make it more scalable? How do we make it sustainable? And really, how do we make this completely mindless for the employer so that hiring talent on inclusively is the exact same as hiring talent on other platforms? I think a lot of emphasis in the past has been around, how can we upskill these candidates? How can we help them to be more attractive to companies? But 50% of the problem is on the employer side. And, the average hiring manager doesn't know how to conduct an interview that's going to be successful for someone with autism. And changing people's culture and process can be a really hard task. And so from a technology perspective, I'm constantly thinking, how do we get this knowledge into the hands of the people at the right time in a way that scales and can be replicated, throughout the hiring industry?
I love that you mentioned this, because this is a huge challenge, an opportunity for employers, because they don't know what they don't know. I'll give you an example. I have a friend, and she was the head of talent attraction for a very large Fortune 10 company, and they brought in some interns for the summer to do some video work, and they were diagnosed with autism. I think there was 2 that came in. And so the first day they brought them in. Here's the lay of the land. Here's what we want you to do. We want you to work on these videos. So about 3 or 4 days later, one of the team members from my friend that was managing these interns came in and said, I have some problems with one of the employees. They are falling asleep at their desk. They're looking like they haven't showered. I don't know what to do. I think we might need to let this person go. And so my friend was like, well, let's have a conversation with them. Let's talk to him and figure out what's going on. And so through the course of conversation, what was found is that when they said, hey, we need you to work on these videos to the intern, they took it literally. And that was all they did for 4 days straight, 24 hours a day, pretty much. All they did was work on this project of these videos, thinking that this should be their sole focus. So making sure that we do have resources and tools and training for employees and managers to have access to, so that they can have these kind of conversations or be equipped to have these kind of conversations is really important, because the way we work is all very different.
Exactly. And I think the way, these sort of annual diversity trainings are great to bring awareness. But if you really want to drive change in action, it needs to be, consistent, and hiring managers, just as you highlighted, they need to have experiences that are timely and relevant so that they can create learnings and continue on the journey. And not just be, required to take an annual diversity training and then think, okay, that was great. Now what? Like, where do I find people? How do I source them? And, everyone's different, not just disability or not, everyone's going to have certain things that make them more or less comfortable just in an interview process. And how could we, modulize that and make it so that interviews are personalized to every single person?
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology Podcast sponsored by Upskill HR and ACE the HR exam. Today, we are talking with Charlotte Dales about technology and the disability employment gap. This podcast is part of our Future of Work series with PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology.
The Workology Podcast Future of Work series is supported by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. PEAT's initiative is to foster collaboration and action around accessible technology in the workplace. PEAT is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP. Learn more about PEAT at peatworks.org. That's PEATWORKS.org.
When we had the kickoff call or the prep call, I was like, this is great. I love what you're doing, because I feel like we just don't know what we don't know until we're placed into a situation that we become uncomfortable with or are unfamiliar, because we are doing that annual diversity and inclusion training, but there's so much more that needs to be happening. Let's talk a little bit about how inclusively works from a technology perspective, particularly the accommodations and tagging structures based on ADA guidelines.
Yep. So we are a professional network and employment platform that connects people with disabilities to employers who are actively trying to increase this population at their companies, which I think is, probably intuitive. But I think what's really important is that we are bringing on employers who are saying, I want access to this talent pool. And this really, our biggest hypothesis in starting this was, will people disclose and feel comfortable being sort of identified as a candidate with a disability out the gate? And that is, step one is being transparent so that everyone can sort of see what maybe they need to adjust in their interview process, et cetera, so that they can set you up for, the highest likelihood of success. So I'd say we really are striving to be like the LinkedIn for people with disabilities. And what makes us really different is that we use a combination of traditional search criteria. We then tag all of our jobs with the accommodations that can be made available under the ADA. So candidates can actually search for jobs based on what accommodations, or as we like to call them, success enablers, will make them thrive. We're also in beta testing now on an algorithm that maps physical and mental characteristics back to the jobs, functions, and skills that make up the workforce and the job titles on our site. So this allows someone to input information about their physical and mental characteristics to help us further rank how we personalize the way we display jobs back to candidates and candidates back to jobs. So creating the best match on both sides. And I guess, to the question around what categories across the disability spectrum are we, going after? The way that we have structured this is that we can be almost completely disability agnostic. We don't ask people to disclose what disability they have. We're symptom and characteristic driven and accommodation driven. And all that really matters is what skills do you have and what accommodations do you need, and what skills does the job require and what accommodations can they make. And that allows us to really scale this to kind of any disability, anyone that's looking for accommodations in the workplace, and not have to, start with any kind of specific area.
Are there certain disability categories that you're working on right now? And what does this mean for candidates' employers?
So I'd say a lot of employers have started with autism. There's been a lot of success with autism at work programs, identifying certain jobs, maybe in tech or QA, that work really well for this demographic. And so we by nature, because this has been a starting point for a lot of companies, have started there, but we really push people to think about how do we replicate that success across all the categories. So I'd say autism is definitely somewhere we've started, but we've placed people on the autism spectrum into tech roles, but we've also placed candidates in marketing roles, copywriter, customer support, kind of all over the map. So we're trying to be as inclusive as we can of this demographic, and not sort of focus on one area at a time. That would be much easier, though, for us in terms of rolling out.
I do think this is important for inclusion, right? And so you are getting it. It makes it, I think, more challenging for you, like, as you're saying,
Yeah.
for rolling out. But if you're looking for to be the LinkedIn for people with disabilities as a destination, I think it lends itself really to the diversity of that, which is very exciting.
Yeah, and I think that it's my biggest thing that I don't want to propel is marginalizing people with certain disabilities into certain jobs, because I don't think there's not a one size fits all. Like, every candidate with autism can't be a software engineer. And so we won't really learn how to best place everyone over time if we're trying to create these little matches and then kind of sticking to what we know and then grabbing another demographic. We need to learn it holistically so that it's really is personalized. It's just about your physical, mental characteristics and your accommodations, and the disability almost becomes lost in the conversation, because it's really just about that person, what they've put in their profile, and what we're identifying as the best match for them.
I want to go back to something focused on employer training. It's such a strong component of what you're doing it inclusively, and obviously something that I'm particularly passionate about. How does this work, and how does it benefit people with disabilities and those employers?
So right now we have a bit more of a manual approach as we build the technology to automate it. So depending on the company and where they are in their journey on this, we will do webinar sessions. We have digital trainings that employers can leverage and send out to their entire employer base. But where we're really getting to is the micro training. So based on who you're interacting with on our platform, you would be sent collation of trainings around their profile, their accommodations for the interview, their accommodations on the job, so that ahead of meeting someone, you actually have a lot more information about how to conduct the best interview and what's going to make that person successful at your organization. And that the benefit is that candidates aren't showing up for interviews, completely unprepared, that you're using the right, meeting tool. If closed captioning works better on one tool versus another, you're kind of removing a lot of these unknowns that exist currently with employers when they're kind of starting to hire people with disabilities for the first time, and they don't know what they don't know, as you said. And I guess for the employer, it gives them sort of more confidence that, they can do this at scale, and that, the average accommodation is under $500. It's not actually as much of a heavy lift as I think a lot of employers and hiring managers have traditionally thought, because it's just kind of been a very big unknown. And so I think the trainings help people see how easy it is to actually make this happen.
Well, I love the training aspect. It just allows for, it helps facilitate those conversations, and it's just delivered in I think a really digestible way for them, giving them exactly kind of like in real time exactly what they need versus waiting for that half day training or whatever's being rolled out, because so much of that gets lost. Either it doesn't get absorbed, or just in just kind of general day to day, you forget. But this gives you it sort of just in time training, I guess, in this area.
Yeah. And I think, proximity to more people with disabilities only is going to increase the level of knowledge that just organically flows. And so we're always telling companies, big or small, so many times they think we have to like prop up this huge program and get all our ducks in a row. And it's not that. You just have to get started. And I think the majority of people with disabilities would rather have a chance to come in, and maybe you make a couple of mistakes, but you're really on top of remediating them versus not being let in the door at all.
Another question I wanted to ask you is if you can help incorporate diversity into a small company as it grows, you can build accessibility and accommodations into your hiring and onboarding processes. We talked a little bit about this also on the prep call. Can you talk about how Inclusively also works with the small to medium-sized business? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to be a big company to be able to do some of these kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, we actually thought that too. We thought, only big companies are really focused on this right now, and they're the only ones that are going to, create investments in these types of products right now. And we've been so wrong. The majority of our inbounds are all coming from smaller companies, which is amazing because not only is it demonstrating that the new wave of companies coming into the world are building this from the ground up, which makes obviously things a lot easier than retrofitting things once you're a 10,000 person company. But they have way less opportunity than a huge company to hire every year. So they're even more motivated to interview our candidates. And, I'd say a lot of times the contract is, 3 jobs in a year, but we're placing 2 out of 3 of them. That's a way higher fill rate than we have with larger organizations who they have the luxury of quantity of jobs where, every job that opens up, they're not urgently trying to fill a diversity quota need, or, they have more opportunities to hire people. So obviously the fill rate is much lower, but I think it's a great nod to what's going on just around us, that it's not just big companies investing in this, but smaller companies as well. And I think the intention is not just around trying to ride this wave of becoming a more inclusive organization. I think people are really starting to see that there's a value to having a more diverse workforce in terms of, a different perspective, opening up your products from an accessibility standpoint to a larger demographic that previously hasn't always been targeted in the same way with services. So I think it's one of it's my favorite companies to work with because I usually know we're always going to make a good amount of placements for them. And I'd say it's also, I think, especially for tech companies that are starting to hire this, I think accessibility from a tech perspective, it needs to be built at the source code level. And the bigger and bigger you get, the harder and harder it is to start to retrofit that. And so if you can hire people with disabilities to help you build your products accessibly, I think that, in the next 10 years, we're going to see those companies are more successful. They appeal and work for a lot more people.
Agreed. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Where can people go if, and I'm sure they will want to go to learn about Inclusively? Where should they go to be able to connect with you and to learn more about Inclusively?
So our website is www.inclusively.com, and you can sign up as a candidate there. We're also really active on Instagram at Work Inclusively, and we love to hear from candidates, employers, anybody through those channels. We're super responsive. And yeah, I guess LinkedIn as well. We speak to a lot of candidates through there as well. So I think for employers and for candidates, you can always get in touch with us via our website.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for sharing what Inclusively is doing. And I hope that listeners will reach out and connect with you to see how they can get some training, support, and resources to be able to employ more people with disabilities.
I do too. Thank you for having me.
Personal and professional development is essential for successful HR leaders. Join Upskill HR to access live training, community, and over 100 on-demand courses for the dynamic leader. HR Research credits available. Visit upskillhr.com for more. I really appreciate Charlotte's insights on this special podcast episode for our Future of Work series powered by PEAT. Accessibility can be built into our work culture as part of hiring, onboarding, training, and employee development. Technology can bridge the gap between employers seeking candidates and job seekers with disabilities. And studies estimate that up to 30% of white-collar professionals have a disability. Thank you for joining the Workology Podcast, sponsored by ACE, the HR Exam, and Upskill HR. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit Workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.